Well, hey, I want to welcome you to Christ Church this weekend. I want to say hello to our Clay County campus as well as our Effingham campus. As many of you know, over the course of the last several weeks, we've been in a series from Hebrews chapter 11. And what we've seen all throughout this series is a story after story of people who have walked by faith. They've put their hope and their trust in God. This weekend is no different. We're going to specifically look at a story of a man named Joseph. Here's what the Hebrew writer says for us in Hebrews 11, verse 22. By faith, Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions concerning the burial of his bones. If you're like me, you might read that verse and you might think to yourself, well, that verse is a little bit strange. But it's not really strange if you understand the story of Joseph's life. You see, for Joseph, he was looking back at the faith that was given to him by his great-great-grandfather, a man named Abraham. If you know the story of Abraham, you know that in the early part of Genesis, Abraham enters into a covenant relationship with God. God promises Abraham a few things. He says, I'll give you a son. I'll make your descendants as numerous as the stars. I'll give you a promised land. See, for Joseph, his life looks like he's been through the fire. It looks like he's been through a whole lot of difficulty and tragedy. But God is constantly refining him. God is using the fire, if you will, of his life, and He's allowing it to shape him and mold him into the person that He wants him to be.
We're introduced to Joseph at the age of 17. We don't know much about his earlier life, but what we do know is that he was his father Jacob's favorite. Many of you know the story of Joseph and the colored coat. It was a sign that Jacob saw Joseph as above all of his other brothers, all of his other siblings. That didn't set well with the rest of Joseph's brothers. And so as we intro this story, we see that Joseph and his brothers are tending their flocks. And Joseph, ever the eager brother, approaches the rest of his brothers and says, I had two dreams. He shares the first. He says, we were out gathering grain and we all gathered our own sheaves, and all of a sudden my sheaf of grain stood up in the middle of all of yours. And in fact, yours didn't just stand there, they bowed down to mine. You can imagine as the younger brother that this really didn't set well with the rest of them. And in the Word it tells us in Genesis 37, this was the moment where they really started to hate Joseph. But that wasn't the end of the story. Joseph then approaches his brothers again. He says, I had a second dream. And in this dream, the sun and the moon and 11 stars all bowed around me. Jacob chastises him for no doubt invoking the anger of his brothers, and his brothers are raging with anger. And they set out a plot to get rid of Joseph. But it tells us at the end of chapter 37 that Jacob pondered these things in his heart. Sometime later, Joseph is again set out to go look for his brothers as they were tending the flocks. Joseph finally reaches them outside of the city of Dothan. As they see Joseph coming, they decide this is the moment we've been waiting for. The moment that we can finally get rid of this favorite child of our father's. The moment we can get rid of Joseph. Joseph approaches his brothers and they immediately set in this motion of a plan to kill Joseph. But Reuben, one of the older brothers, steps up and says, let's not kill him so that the blood isn't on our hands. Let's throw him in the cistern. And so, as they prepare to embark on this plan, they see some Midianite merchants coming. They know that they're heading to Egypt, and they decide, hey, just so we can keep our conscience clear, just so we can keep our name out of this issue, let's sell our brother Joseph to the Midianite merchants. We don't know what the actual cost of Joseph was, but we know that they got a sum for Joseph, and Joseph sets out with the Midianites to Egypt. Life is never going to be the same. In this moment, it seems as though Joseph's life is over, but God is just beginning to write his story.
Ultimately, Joseph ends up being sold to a man named Potiphar. He's in Egypt. He's working for Potiphar. Now, it's noteworthy that Potiphar means executioner. So he's working for a man with a lot of authority, a lot of power, and a guy who's pretty much ruthless. But it tells us in verse 2 of chapter 39 that God was with Joseph. In fact, as we read this story in chapter 39, it tells us that 4 times. But the circumstances just don't feel that way. How could he still be a slave? How could he experience the things he does here? Although he is innocent, he ends up being accused of trying to take advantage of Potiphar's wife. Yet the Lord is with him. The Bible tells us that Joseph was handsome. He's ultimately blessed and put in charge of everything in Potiphar's house, except Potiphar's wife. And she's attracted to him. She makes a pass at him. She flirts with him. It's a daily thing that he has to tell her no. Then one day she catches him alone. She proposes to him. He again says no. And she's close enough to grab his cloak as he runs from the room. She keeps a hold of it and then says, Joseph tried to take advantage of me. Now the Lord was obviously still with him, because when Potiphar makes a decision as to what to do, he sends Joseph off to prison instead of to death.
As we approach Genesis chapter 40, what we're constantly reminded of is in the moments where it seems like Joseph's story is ending or it ends in utter failure, God continually provides blessing, continually provides redemption to the story. And this section is no different. As we see Joseph thrown into prison, what we see is that God uses that. And Joseph wins the favor of the warden of the prison. And it tells us in chapter 40 that the warden pays no attention to the prison's affairs from this point forward. Everything is under Joseph's command. Well, as time passes on and Joseph is still in prison, we see 2 of Pharaoh's royal subjects, the cupbearer and the royal baker, come to be thrown into prison. We don't know what happened. We just know that they have suffered the wrath of Pharaoh. Over the coming days, Joseph begins to know them and come to build a relationship with them. And he notices on this particular day that both of them seem down. And he asks the question, why are you so down? What's going on? And they tell him that they've both had a dream, but nobody seems to be able to interpret. And Joseph says, well, isn't it up to God to interpret dreams? So he says, tell me your dream. The cupbearer starts and he says, in my dream, I had this vine, and on this vine were 3 separate branches. And on each branch there was a blossom of grapes. And as the grapes ripened, I squeezed the grapes into Pharaoh's cup and handed Pharaoh's cup back to him. Can you make sense of this dream? And Joseph says, God's made this pretty plain. That in 3 days, Pharaoh is going to restore you to your position. As the royal baker sees that Joseph has given the cupbearer a pretty favorable interpretation, he decides, well, I'm going to tell him my dream as well. And he says, in my dream, I had 3 baskets of baked goods resting on my head. And in one of the baskets, the one that was on top, the birds seemed to be picking at it. Joseph, can you tell me what this means? And Joseph replies, God has made this clear, that in 3 days, Pharaoh will cut off your head and he'll impale your body on a pole and the birds will eat your flesh. What we see from this is that everything that God said would happen, happened. It's in this moment that Joseph tells the cupbearer, hey, when this happens, when God's promise is fulfilled to you, don't forget about me here. We see this story coming to a close with the cupbearer forgetting Joseph. It seems as though the suffering will continue. But as we continually see in the story and the life of Joseph, what man meant for evil, God can use for good. And this story is no different.
At the age of 30, Joseph finally experiences freedom. and he's made second in command in all of Egypt. Now, the experience that he had had through interpreting dreams taught him that 7 years of plenty were coming. And so he engineered a plan that they should set aside, they should save that abundance for the years of difficulty that are coming, 7 years of drought that had been foretold to him. So for 7 years, they set aside the plenty, ridiculous amounts of plenty, and then the drought began. And in just 2 years, the rest of the world is running out of food, and Egypt has an abundance. And everybody's coming with their money to Joseph in Egypt. It takes a couple of years before his brothers and his own personal family have to go to Egypt themselves to get food. And there's an incredible, long, drawn-out, detailed story that I just don't have time to go into about how they met and how they interacted with each other. But the conclusion is, after about 22 years of being separated from his dad, the whole family moves to Egypt. And the line of his great-grandpa Abraham is preserved. That's the line of promise. The line that was promised to bring a Messiah, someone who would be a Savior, a blessing to all the world. The line that leads to Jesus survives through the difficulty that Joseph experienced.
Near the end of the book of Genesis, we get a summary of the life of Joseph. In fact, listen to what Genesis 50 says about Joseph's life. But Joseph said to them, that's Joseph speaking to his brothers, "Don't be afraid, I am in the place of God. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." I love those two words, but God. See, at the time, Joseph didn't understand that God was using what he was walking through to refine him and to use those situations to make him into the person that God wanted him to be. Don't get me wrong here, like God didn't cause the bad things. He didn't cause Joseph to be sold into slavery by his brothers. He didn't cause Potiphar's wife to lust after Joseph, but he used it. He used all of the things that Joseph had walked through in this life to draw him closer to God, to shape him, to mold him into the person that he wanted him to be. Listen, I don't know where you are today. Like I don't know if you walked in this weekend and you feel like you and God are far apart. You feel like you're walking through a difficult season of life and you're wondering and asking the question, God, why? See, I want you to notice in this story that God is offering redemption. God is offering restoration. God is offering grace. And I love what the Apostle Paul says in Romans 8 when he says, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who've been called according to His purpose." See, I think what we learn from the life of Joseph is that faith is so much more than faith in a moment, but faith is a lifestyle. And the question I think we have to wrestle with from this story is will we put our faith in God? Will we cling to Him? Will we hold on to Him even when life is difficult and it's hard? Because the invitation is this, to put our faith and to put our hope in Jesus.